I was talking to a friend the other day who was complaining about the price of eggs. The government just needs to step in, he said, and put a cap on what these stores can charge. It's a basic necessity. He sounded so reasonable, so compassionate. He just wanted families to be able to afford breakfast. To him, it was a simple, middle-of-the-road fix for a temporary problem. But as we kept talking, I started to notice a pattern. He wanted a price ceiling on eggs, but when I pointed out that farmers might stop producing them if they couldn't turn a profit, his solution wasn't to back off, it was to go further. Well, then the government should just subsidize the chicken feed, he argued, and if the feed companies raise their prices, we cap those too. He didn't realize it, but in the span of a 5-minute conversation, he had moved from a single intervention to a demand for the state to control the entire agricultural supply chain. It's a seductive idea. The mixed economy. We like to think we can keep the freedom of capitalism while using just a little bit of government force to smooth out the edges. We call it social democracy or interventionism, and it feels like a safe, moderate compromise between two extremes. But there's a fundamental logic at play here that most people miss. A logic that even the most famous economists and the founders of communism actually agreed on. Whether you're looking at price controls on milk, tariffs on steel, or progressive taxes on inheritance, these middle-of-the-road policies aren't a stable destination. They are a one-way street. Today, we're going to explore why that moderate path almost inevitably leads to the very thing its supporters claim to be avoiding, the total abolition of private property. It turns out that when it comes to the economy, there is no such thing as standing still in the middle of the road. You're either moving toward freedom or you're sliding toward socialism. Let's look at the logic and the data behind why the middle of the road is actually a slippery slope.
It is a fascinating and, frankly, a somewhat terrifying realization when you actually trace that logic. That conversation you had about the eggs, it's not just a one-off thing. It's a perfect textbook demonstration of a phenomenon that economists like Ludwig von Mises were writing about a century ago.
Right. And the central idea, the thesis for this whole deep dive, is that this middle of the road, this place we all think is so safe and stable, is an illusion.
It's not a permanent address. It's a transition phase, a rest stop on a highway. But the highway only goes in one direction.
And that's such a heavy concept because moderation is always sold as the virtue, right? The rational choice. Extremes are bad. The middle is good. That's, the default for most of us.
Of course. It feels safe. It feels reasonable.
But the logic we're digging into today suggests that, in economics at least, the middle is mechanically unstable. It's like trying to balance a ball on the point of a pin.
It can't stay there. So before we really get into that slippery slope, we should probably set the terms. These words get thrown around so much.
Absolutely. Capitalism, socialism, they're used more as insults than descriptions these days. So for our purposes here, how are we defining them? Let's start with capitalism.
Right. Let's strip it back to the technical economic definition. For this analysis, capitalism isn't just about liking money or having big corporations. It's a very specific system where the only legitimate role of the government is the protection of private property from violence and theft. It's about setting up the rules of the game, no stealing, no fraud, and then letting people play. It's the absence of coercion in voluntary exchange.
So it's fundamentally about protecting property rights, not about being pro-business, but about being anti-coercion.
Exactly. It's the framework of rights that allows a market to function. Now, on the flip side, you have socialism.
And here we're not using some, scare word definition. We're using the one from the source.
We're using the one Karl Marx himself used. He was very clear. He summed up the entire theory of communism in one single sentence: the abolition of private property.
So it's not about social programs or being nice to people. The technical definition is the end of private ownership.
Yes. In practice, it means the ownership of all the means of production. Your factories, your farms, your transportation, by the community. And, in the real world, the community always ends up being the state.
Okay, so we have our two poles: total protection of property versus total abolition of property. So the middle road, this mixed economy, is where my friend and his eggs live. He doesn't want the state to own the chickens, but he wants the state to set the price of eggs. He wants to keep the title deed to the farm, but he wants the government telling the farmer how to run it.
That is the perfect description of what Mises called interventionism. It's the belief that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can keep private property, but you can also use government decrees to steer it towards certain social goals.
And the core insight from Mises, which is what, from the 1920s?
Yes, this is not a new idea. His argument was that this is impossible, not because of some political ideology, but because of the pure mechanics of how an economy works. He said rational economic calculation is impossible without private ownership and real money prices.
Why are prices so important? They seem so arbitrary sometimes.
But prices are information. They are signals. A high price for eggs is a signal from society to farmers saying, hey, we need more eggs. It tells entrepreneurs where to invest resources. If you interfere with those prices, you are essentially flying blind. You're smashing the compass of the economy and then wondering why everyone is lost.
Okay, let's unpack that smashing the compass idea. It can sound a bit abstract. You use the egg example, but Mises has this classic step-by-step breakdown using milk. It's almost like a recipe for how one good intention leads to total control.
And seeing it step by step is really what makes it click. So, step one, the government, with the best of intentions, decides milk is too expensive for poor families. A noble goal.
Right. They want to help.
They want to help. So they impose a price ceiling. They declare that milk cannot be sold for more than, say, $3 a gallon, when the market price was $5.
And for about 5 minutes, every consumer is thrilled. Cheap milk for everyone.
Yes, it looks like a huge win. But then the economic reaction begins immediately. You have to think about the producers, the dairy farmers. In any industry, you have what are called marginal producers.
The ones just barely making it.
Exactly. The farmer with the older equipment or the less fertile land.
Yeah.
They were scraping by, maybe making a small profit of $5 a gallon. But at $3, they're losing money on every single gallon of milk they produce.
So they can't absorb that cost. They're not some giant corporation.
No. The rational thing, they stop producing milk. They might sell their dairy cows for beef, which is more profitable now. They might switch their fields to growing corn. Some just go out of business entirely.
So the total supply of milk in the country starts to shrink.
It drops. At the very same time, what's happening on the demand side? The price is artificially low at $3. So people who used to buy 1 gallon now buy 2. Restaurants start using more milk in their recipes. Demand explodes.
Less milk being made, more people wanting to buy it. You've just created a shortage.
You have manufactured a shortage, and now the government has a crisis on its hands. The very people they wanted to help, the poor families, now can't get milk at any price. The shelves are empty.
So now the government is at a fork in the road.
A critical fork. Choice A is to admit that price control was a mistake, repeal the law, and let the price go back up to $5.
Which would make farmers start producing again.
Would, but politically, that looks like a huge defeat. It looks like you're caving to greedy farmers and turning your back on the poor.
Yeah, that's not a headline any politician wants.
It's a political suicide. So they almost always choose choice B, double down. They decide to intervene even more. They say, the problem isn't our price cap. The problem is that the farmers' costs are too high. They blame the greedy companies that sell cattle feed, or the ones that make milking machines.
So they decide to fix those prices too.
Yes. To make the $3 milk price viable, they now have to impose price controls on the inputs. They cap the price of fodder. They cap the price of hay. They might even try to cap the wages of farmhands.
And doesn't that just kick the can down the road? Now the guy who grows the hay is losing money.
You see the pattern immediately. It's infectious. Now the marginal hay farmer goes out of business. So to fix the new hay shortage, the government has to control the price of his inputs, fertilizer, tractors, fuel.
It just keeps spreading.
It spreads like a virus through the economy. The economist Lester Thurow had a great line for this. Regulation leads to regulation. It moves from milk to hay to fertilizer to trucking to fuel to the steel used to make the trucks.
And eventually you get to a point where the government is setting the price for almost everything.
And if you're setting the prices of everything a business sells, you logically have to start setting the price of what it buys, including labor. You have to set wages.
At which point, what does private ownership even mean?
It means nothing. Mises points out that once the government is the one deciding what is produced, in what quantity, at what price, for what wage, the concept of private property is a legal fiction. It's a sham.
You might still have the deed to the farm in your safe deposit box.
But you have zero control. Mises had a German term for this, the Zwangswirtschaft.
The compulsory economy.
The economy of compulsion. Yeah. And he pointed out this was precisely the model used in Nazi Germany. They didn't formally nationalize everything. Businesses still had their names on the door. But the state directed every aspect of production. It's covert socialism.
It's fascinating because we tend to think of this slide happening by accident. You know, a series of blunders by well-meaning but incompetent bureaucrats.
That's the common story.
But when you look at the history, especially the writings of someone like Friedrich Engels, Marx's collaborator, you realize this instability wasn't a bug. For them, it was a feature.
That's a crucial point to understand. In his Principles of Communism, Engels laid out the strategy. He didn't say, day one, we ban all property and send in the tanks. It was much more subtle.
What did he propose?
He argued that democracy was basically useless to the working class, unless it was used immediately as a tool to attack private property. And the measures he listed, they sound incredibly familiar today. A heavy progressive income tax, very high inheritance taxes, the centralization of all credit and banking into a single state-run national bank, gradual state takeover of factories and transport.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty standard platform for a social democratic party in Europe today. Most people would not hear that and think communism.
No, they wouldn't. They sound moderate now. But you have to understand Engels' intent. He saw these not as the final goal, but as transitional measures. He knew, just as Mises knew from the other side, that these policies would destabilize the capitalist system. They would create contradictions and crises.
And those crises would then justify the next round of interventions.
Exactly. He planned to ride the slippery slope. The middle road wasn't a place to live for him. It was the on-ramp to the highway of total state control.
We often think of this control strictly in terms of money prices, wages, taxes. But the middle road doesn't stop at your wallet, it moves into your mind. We have to look at how this logic transfers from pure economics to the way we live our daily lives. I heard about a man named Elias who lived in a city that prided itself on the middle road. He ran a small, specialized furniture workshop, a craft he had perfected over 30 years. It began with a simple intervention, a state-mandated wellness and psychological safety protocol designed to ensure that every employee's emotional state was monitored by government-certified therapists. At first, it seemed compassionate, but I saw a video Elias posted recently where he looked utterly defeated. He explained that he can no longer assign tasks based on skill or deadlines because the state therapists have determined that stress-inducing productivity is a violation of the collective well-being. The government now dictates his workshop's layout, its hours, and even the tone of his conversations, all under the guise of therapeutic care. Elias told his viewers that he feels like a ghost in his own shop. He still owns the title to the building, but he has lost the agency to make a single, meaningful decision. The therapeutic state has effectively absorbed his will into a larger social plan. Reading this story, I can't help but feel a profound sense of loss for the individual. As someone who analyzes these trends, I see how a genuine desire to support mental health can be weaponized into a tool for total social planning. It's a gentle erosion, not a violent revolution, but a slow tide that washes away the very idea of a self-directed life. We start by wanting people to be okay, and we end up with a system where no one is allowed to be free if that freedom causes the slightest ripple in the state's calculated peace.
That story about Elias, it's a perfect, if heartbreaking example of what Andrew Polsky called the rise of the therapeutic state. And you should notice the parallel with the economic example is one-to-one.
So?
Well, with the milk, the state intervened to fix what it saw as a price problem. Here, in Elias's workshop, the state is intervening to fix a wellness problem. The logic is identical.
And just like with the milk, it didn't stop with a gentle suggestion or a helpful pamphlet. It became a protocol. It became mandatory.
Exactly. And Polsky argues that this impulse, it almost always starts from a good place. It's rooted in philanthropy or the progressive era's desire to, uplift and normalize the working class.
But the mechanism it uses is what he calls tutelage.
Tutelage implies a teacher-student relationship, or maybe more accurately, a parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
The state stops treating adult citizens as independent agents who can make their own choices, take their own risks, and, live with the consequences.
And it starts treating them like children.
Or clients, is the modern term. People who need to be managed and cared for because they can't govern their own lives.
This feels like a very different kind of state power. The old liberal state, the one from the 19th century, it basically wanted your taxes and maybe you for a war,
Right.
But it left your home and your business alone for the most part.
It wasn't interested in your domestic life. The therapeutic state, on the other hand, invades the domestic sanctuary. It wants to change how you raise your children, how you spend your money, your personal relationships. A traditional tyrant, a king, he probably doesn't care about the tone of your voice when you talk to an employee.
As long as you pay your taxes, you're fine.
Right. But the therapeutic state cares deeply. It demands your internal conformity, not just your external obedience.
This connects directly to the work of someone like Thomas Saz. He talked about the myth of mental illness. Now, just to be very clear, he's not saying people don't suffer or that things like depression aren't real, painful experiences.
No, His point is much more subtle. He's talking about how the label of illness is used by the state.
Right. He argues the state medicalizes behavior it doesn't like.
If you're a dissident, if you're just eccentric, or if you refuse to conform to the new social protocols, like Elias wanting to push his team to meet a deadline, the system relabels you. You're not just wrong, you're sick.
And if you're sick, then you need to be treated.
It's a clever move. On one hand, it removes your personal responsibility. You're not bad, you're just ill. It feels compassionate.
But on the other hand, it removes your rights.
It completely removes your rights. Because if you were diagnosed as sick, the state then has a duty to cure you, whether you consent to the treatment or not.
And Saz pointed out this creates a kind of catch-22, right?
Oops. If the client, in this case Elias, resists this therapeutic help, what does the state do? It doesn't say, oh, okay, he's a different opinion on management. It says his resistance is a symptom of his illness.
His resistance is proof he's sick. His denial or maladjustment justifies even more intervention.
The more you fight back, the more you prove that you need them to control you. It's a perfectly sealed room with no exit. So Elias, he gets to keep the title to his workshop, just like Mises predicted in the economic model.
But the therapeutic regulations have stripped him of all meaningful control. He's been normalized into obedience. So when you replace that economic calculation with regulation, and you replace personal responsibility with this kind of therapeutic management, you fundamentally change what you're optimizing for. You stop optimizing for competence. You start optimizing for compliance. And this is where things start to physically break, where the rubber meets the road, or in this case, where the road itself starts to collapse. I was browsing through a series of investigative reports about a once renowned engineering firm in a major Western capital. For decades, this firm was the gold standard for infrastructure, built on an uncompromising meritocratic foundation. However, to comply with new regulatory equity frameworks, the firm began prioritizing identity-based quotas over technical certifications for lead roles. When a major transit bridge they designed showed structural cracks within 2 years, the fallout was predictable. But instead of returning to merit-based standards, the government used the failure as a justification for an Emergency Oversight Act. I read that they have now installed permanent government equity auditors inside the firm to oversee every calculation. The failure, caused by an abandonment of merit in favor of regulation, created a feedback loop where the only solution offered was even more government overreach. The firm is now essentially a branch of the bureaucracy, no longer capable of independent failure or independent success. Watching this unfold, it strikes me as a tragic irony. We often see these equity policies as a way to level the playing field. But when they ignore the cold, hard reality of competence, the resulting collapse becomes the excuse for the state to seize the entire field. As a YouTuber covering these institutional shifts, I find it alarming how failure is no longer a signal to improve, but a pretext to expand. It's a cycle that seems to have no off-ramp other than total state control of industry.
That phrase you used, the feedback loop of failure, is absolutely central to this. We're drawing here from analysis by Harold Robertson, who looks at complex systems. His core argument is that certain systems, think aviation, nuclear power plants, high-level infrastructure engineering, are incredibly unforgiving.
They don't have much room for error.
They have zero room for error. Gravity doesn't care about your good intentions. Physics, as he puts it, is discriminatory. It discriminates ruthlessly against incompetence.
So when you introduce what he calls a double line,
it's the myth that you can try to maximize two competing variables at the same time. You can't say, we will maximize for equity and for performance simultaneously. He argues that was a lie all along. In a complex system, you have to optimize for one thing: competence. The moment you pause meritocratic standards for any other social goal, you begin to degrade the system's ability to function.
And we've seen real-world examples that seem to point to this. The door plug blowing off the Boeing 737 MAX, or the alarming number of near-miss runway incursions with air traffic control. These aren't just random accidents. They seem to be symptoms of a systemic degradation.
But here's the crucial political twist. And this brings us to what the Center for Asian Legal Studies calls the argument from failure. When an institution fails, when the bridge cracks or the plane door blows off, what is the response from the middle road state?
They never, ever say, oops, maybe our regulations and our interference caused this problem.
Never. That's admitting fault. Instead, they say, we didn't interfere enough. The failure becomes the very justification for more power, for more expansion.
So because the private firm, which was already being forced to comply with these regulations, failed to build a safe bridge, the state's conclusion is that private firms can't be trusted at all.
And the solution is an Emergency Oversight Act. We need to install permanent government equity auditors to watch over their shoulders.
It's a self-licking ice cream cone. The government's intervention causes the failure, and the failure is then used as proof that more government intervention is needed.
It is a perfect closed loop. And this process accelerates the rise of what thinkers like James Burnham and Samuel Francis called the managerial state. It's the rise of a new ruling class, a managerial elite. They're not capitalists, they're not politicians in the old sense. They're bureaucrats, administrators, therapists, auditors. They use technical jargon and administrative law to bypass democracy and property rights.
And they see people not as citizens, but as resources.
Exactly. Human resources to be managed. If the bridge cracks, that's a management problem. The solution is more management, more oversight, more bureaucracy.
What's so terrifying about that is that there's no correction mechanism. In a free market, if your engineering firm builds a bridge that cracks, you go bankrupt. Your failure is punished by reality.
Here, the failure is rewarded, or at least it's used as fuel for the expansion of the managerial state's power. Institutional failure becomes the primary engine for institutional expansion.
We've seen how the economy is regulated, how competence is eroded. But through all of that, there was always one last wall, one final barrier protecting the individual. The simple concept of private property itself. But now, it seems even that wall is being dissolved by a new kind of acid. I saw a fascinating and somewhat polarizing documentary about a small-scale landlord named Sarah in a district where identity-based land use policies were recently trialed. Sarah had invested her life savings into a 3-unit apartment building. However, new radical political movements in her city successfully lobbied for social justice zoning, which allows groups to claim cultural squatting rights if they belong to a historically marginalized identity, effectively overriding Sarah's private rental contracts. I saw an interview where she was told that her private property rights were secondary to the collective identity needs of the community. The traditional norms of private property, the very barrier Mises described as the final wall against socialism, were being dissolved not by an army, but by a new vocabulary of identity politics. Sarah still pays the taxes, but she no longer has the right to decide who enters or stays on her property. This story is incredibly heavy, and I know it touches on some very raw nerves regarding social justice and historical labels. Looking at it through my lens, I can understand the deep-seated desire to rectify past exclusions, but we have to ask ourselves, if we dissolve the concept of private property based on identity, what is left to protect any of us from the state? It's a move that replaces the rule of law with the rule of the collective. And while the intentions might be framed as revolutionary justice, the practical result is the total evaporation of individual security. It's a vivid example of how the middle road uses our most sensitive social issues to pave the way toward a completely planned society.
Sarah's story is really the end of the road we've been traveling down this whole time. It's the culmination. Remember, Mises identified private property as the final barrier against total state control. If you own your land, your home, your tools, you have a small sphere of independence, a place where you are sovereign.
But this new approach attacks that idea directly. It's no longer a simple question of, do you hold the title deed to this building?
No. The question now becomes, who are you? And who is the person making a claim against your property? Your rights become contingent on your group identity.
This is what Christopher Caldwell refers to as the new Constitution. What is he describing? Is it an actual document?
It's not a single document you can hold. It's a body of civil rights laws, executive orders, judicial rulings, and HR codes that have been built up over decades. And this new Constitution, he argues, effectively overrides the old one based on individual rights and free association.
So it dictates who you're allowed to associate with.
It governs who you can hire, who you must rent to, who a bank can lend money to. It inserts the state and the logic of group identity into every single private transaction.
So if Sarah tries to enforce her old property rights under the old Constitution, say by evicting a tenant who is not paying rent but is claiming these cultural squatting rights, she becomes the criminal.
That is the essence of what Samuel Francis termed anarcho-tyranny. It's a very specific and strange form of state power.
How does it work? Anarchy and tyranny sound like opposites.
But what he means is a state that refuses to enforce basic laws against actual criminals. That's the anarchy part. It allows theft, squatting, vandalism to go unpunished. At the same time, it aggressively and tyrannically regulates every aspect of the lives of law-abiding citizens like Sarah. That's the tyranny part. The state allows squatters to violate her property rights with impunity, but it will bring its full force down on her if she tries to defend her own property.
This connects back to the idea of a soft totalitarianism we talked about with Elias's workshop. Sarah isn't being arrested by secret police in the middle of the night and sent to a gulag.
No, it's much more polite. She's being defeated by a zoning board, by a civil rights commission, by an HR department. It's a totalitarianism enforced by bureaucracy and social pressure.
But the end result is identical to the hard totalitarianism of the 20th century.
The result is the same. The state controls all human interaction. The individual has no rights, no sanctuary, no property that the state is bound to respect. The middle road has finally led to a place where, as the slogan goes, you will own nothing.
Okay, so let's try to pull all of these threads together because we've covered a huge amount of ground here. We started this whole deep dive with a conversation about the price of eggs.
A price cap. And we trace the logic. The price cap inevitably leads to shortages. The shortages then justify cost controls. The cost controls spread until the state is managing the entire supply chain. You can't just break one law of economics. You eventually have to break all of them.
Then we saw that same logic of control expand from the economic sphere to the personal one, from the wallet to the mind. We looked at the story of Elias, who lost control of his own workshop, not to economic planners, but to therapeutic planners who wanted to manage the wellness of his employees.
Which showed how the middle road assumes it can manage society like a neat and tidy machine. But humans aren't hogs. And the attempt to make them so requires ever more intrusive forms of control.
And that shift from focusing on merit to focusing on regulation and compliance created the competence crisis. We saw the engineering firm where the feedback loop of failure wasn't a signal to change course.
No, it was used as justification for more bureaucracy, not better engineering. The state, in this model, literally feeds on its own incompetence. Its failures become its fuel.
And finally, that brought us to Sarah and her apartment building, where the very foundation of private property itself was dissolved by the new acid of identity politics and this new constitution.
And the common thread, the engine driving this entire process from Mises in the 1920s to what we see today, is that there's no such thing as standing still. You can't just have one intervention.
Right.
Every single intervention creates a distortion in the fabric of society. That distortion creates a new crisis. And that new crisis is then used as the public justification for the next, deeper intervention. It's a ratchet that only turns in one direction.
The middle road is a myth because it assumes you can just stop the process. It assumes you can suspend the laws of cause and effect.
Right. We all like to think we can have the best of both worlds, the efficiency and dynamism of capitalism, but with the supposed compassion and security of total state planning.
But what all this analysis suggests is that's a mirage. You can't have your cake and regulate it, too.
You cannot have real price signals without free markets. You cannot have free markets without secure private property. And you cannot have secure private property if the state claims the power to override your individual rights for any collective goal it deems important, whether it's social, therapeutic, or based on identity.
And that brings us back to that argument from failure, which I think is maybe the most provocative thought to leave you with from this whole discussion. We seem to have built a system where the government's own failures, whether it's in our schools or transportation safety, our economy, those failures don't lead to a reduction in its power. They don't lead to people saying, maybe we should try more freedom.
They lead to an expansion of its power.
When the schools fail, the answer is always more money and more federal programs. When the regulations cause a bridge to crack, the answer is more regulators. When the price controls cause a food shortage, the answer is rationing.
The more the middle road trembles beneath our feet, the louder the calls become to just pave over what little private ground is left, to widen the road for the state.
The destination hasn't changed since Mises identified it 100 years ago. We're just traveling down that road much, much faster.
And that's why understanding the mechanics of the slope, the actual logic of it, is so vital. If you don't know where the road leads, you can't ever make a conscious decision to get off.